Dr. Jim Gibb will be our guest speaker tonight, and he'll be leading the presentation. And my name is Allison. I work for St. Mary's County Library as a librarian. Okay, Dr. Gibb, are you ready to get started?
I'm ready to go. I hope
Fantastic.
everybody can hear. Um, if you can't, scream out, huh? Okay. Um, tonight's talk is unusual in that it has a co-presenter. Whether or not that co-presenter knows she's a co-presenter, I'm not sure. Um, Elizabeth Eckel, Liz. We haven't seen her in several years, but most of what I'm going to cover tonight uh, is based on research she did and based on a slide talk, a presentation she gave at a professional conference, I think back in 2017. But this is ongoing research. Coal does not sound like a really exciting subject to most folks. But the point I want to make tonight is that simply noting whether coal ash appears on an archaeological site that we can date is potentially very useful information. And when I say coal ash, I'm talking about coal that has partially burned or completely burned, leaving nothing but the residue ash. So whether it's completely burned or not, we're going to just call it all coal ash. Okay, so I'm going to start off with this fascinating graphic uh, that, oops, that shows the various sorts of um, uh, energy sources used over the last couple of hundred years. And so you can see petroleum here is very high. It's still really the mainstay, or at least up until about 10 years ago. We've not updated this graph to include up through at least 2023. But petroleum has been very big in our economy, natural gas increasingly so, especially since 1970s. Nuclear power um, has it's been there, but it's not been huge. Hydroelectric, fairly minor. Wood, of course, uh, hardly shows at all. But I want you to look at the black line that represents coal. And it starts off probably around 1850, increases very slowly until it sort of jumps up around 1900 and probably peaks initially in the 1950s. According to the US Census, in 1950, half of American households heated with coal. And I'm not talking about heating with coal-generated electricity. I mean heating with coal. And if you want a sense of that, if you haven't lived in a house that's been heated by coal, if you've ever seen the movie is it called A Christmas Story? It's a comedy, and it has Darren McGavin in it, and the joke that kind of runs through the show is him wrestling with his coal furnace in the basement. Um, but after the 1950s, coal, although we increased the usage of coal nationally, more and more of that coal was going into power plants to generate electricity, not to heat houses. Starting in the 1950s, electric heating became increasingly common. I grew up in a house that had electric baseboard heat. Uh, Water was heated electrically and circulated through baseboard heaters. And then, basically, fuel oil really took over and is still a major source of household fuel. So we're looking at this growth from 1900 into the 1950s of coal being very important, and then kind of dropping off as for household use and other sources becoming more common. So I'm going to talk a little bit about getting coal, mining coal, and then its use in the modern kitchen and for heating plants in houses. By the way, yeah, if you folks may want to mute your audio just to avoid feedback and background noises. Okay. So just a quick primer
Okay.
on where coal comes from. Most coal formed from deposits, tropical deposits formed in the Carboniferous period, roughly 300 million years ago. And so it's lots of organic matter. And that organic matter is increasingly covered and weighed down by other sediments over 300 million years. The pressure of those sediments is partially which compacts the material to create coal. But also, as you increase pressure, you're also increasing temperature. If you apply increasing amounts of pressure, it generates more heat. And so what we get are sort of a continuum of coal formation from lignite, which is kind of looks like fossilized wood, down to hard anthracitic coal, and a lot of variability in between, which this next graphic shows pretty nicely. So you start off with peat, and under pressure and heat over a long enough period of time, water and other minerals are extracted, and that material becomes more and more compact until we get anthracite. Now, there are categories here: peat, lignite, subbituminous, bituminous, and anthracite. But it really is a continuum. And you'll see that when I talk a little bit about coal being sold to consumers. So you can see examples in the middle part of the slide. And off to the right with this map, you could see anthracite up in eastern Pennsylvania, anthracite coal down in southern Virginia. This is just the East Coast. There's a lot of coal out west, Montana, a major coal producer these days. But as you move westward, you get into areas where it's bituminous and then subbituminous. So as you head west, the coal becomes a lower quality. Uh, it's uh, it's not as energy dense as anthracite is. So anthracite is the optimal coal to buy because you get a lot more British thermal units out of it. You get a lot more heat, a lot more energy when you burn it. So we're going to look at the period of domestic coal use, which is going to be, probably around the 1840s up until early to mid 1950s. And again, as you can see on this graph, how that figures into the other sources of energy that take over rapidly from coal, uh, beginning around a little after World War II. Just on the East Coast, again, this coal is mined out west. But you can see the different graphs here. Maryland is way at the bottom. There's some coal out western Maryland. I'm not even sure it's being mined nowadays. But if you drive through parts of western Maryland, you can see these old coal mines. Virginia, Southern Virginia has produced coal consistently. Relatively speaking, not a lot, but significant. But Pennsylvania, which shows up as a sort of lime green here, and this brick red, big source of coal, mostly from throughout Pennsylvania. Anthracite dropping off pretty rapidly after about 1900. Bituminous coal being mined right up until the present. Pennsylvania is interesting in terms of coal history because that's where there was some significant and quite violent strikes, labor movement, uh, coming into conflict with the coal mine owners. And so there you could see some of this stuff in Hollywood films. There are lots and lots of books about it. Huge labor problems, which is probably one of the reasons why people started looking for coal further west was to basically break away from the unions. And of course, West Virginia in here is very high. It continues to be a major coal producer. But Maryland, not so much. And you're all probably familiar with you got these coal mines, they're dug down deep and they put in steel rails, narrow gauge rails. They have these carts which initially were pulled by livestock. This one being I guess that's a mule wearing a hat. Uh, and increasingly motorized, lots of child labor initially in these operations, not only to haul the coal out, but also in sorting it, pulling out useless rock, non-coal. Here's a better idea of a early 20th century system where you have motorized rail car that's actually bringing miners in and out. And look at the number of miners there. This is a substantial operation. Initially, a lot of coal, well, up through maybe 1900 or so, was brought in to the East Coast by canal boats. In fact, as the rail system started around 1840 and really picked up around the Civil War, railroads began to capture more and more of the transportation market. And I talked about this a couple of months ago. So canal boats increasingly were carrying just sort of bulk load material, and coal was a major part of that. So they'd be carrying coal out through the C&O Canal, for instance, from Cumberland down to Washington, D.C., where it'll go to distributors for sale. Canal network, around 1840, the dark lines represent existing canals, dashed ones, proposed canals or under construction. And then just east of Pittsburgh, around Johnstown, is actually a little bit of rail in there. And that's for uh, a inclined plane that would take canal boats effectively over the mountains. And of course, you can see Washington, D.C. represented by the red star. So the canal network is fairly extensive, but is not sufficiently extensive really to reach into the coal mining areas and to move a lot of coal to the coast. On the other hand, about a generation later, 1862, we have railroads all over the place. Railroads are relatively easy to build. You have a grade of less than 3%. It's narrow, usually 66 feet wide. You can bridge gullies, rivers fairly inexpensively. They're relatively inexpensive to maintain. The locomotives could be fueled with coal. So when they go to coal mines to fill up their cars with coal, they are also filling up to fuel the locomotive. So railroads become a major way of exploiting coal beds. And again, railroads start around 1840. Baltimore area was very early. It was probably the earliest in the country to get going with railroads. And in the 1850s, 1860s, they're really becoming very widespread. I don't have a date on this picture. Liz found this. Look at the number of coal cars there. That's a lot of rock. As far as the eye can see, coal was really important. And yet, despite the amount you see here, despite how important it was as a fuel by the early first decade or two of the 20th century, there were coal shortages. And you'll see this in period newspapers. People were freezing. Poor people had a devil of a time buying coal because nobody wanted to sell them, a couple of hundredweight at a time. They want to sell a ton at a time. And you'll see how that happened in a few moments. There were charitable organizations set up to provide coal. It was really an issue. Partly it was labor unrest. Partly it's major corporations gaming the system, trying to increase profits. But eventually the coal comes down to the major cities. This happens to be Annapolis. Um, and it could come by water, or it could come by rail. In the case of Annapolis, I think it came both ways. In Annapolis, I've got this white arrow on the left-hand part of the slide that shows the location of one of these coal yards that had access to a railroad siding and also a wharf. So it could bring in coal by train and then load coal onto steamboats, which can then bring it to smaller communities around the Chesapeake Bay. Here's one of those coal yards here, Parlett Coal and Lumber Yard, right along the basin, was now Eagle Alley in Annapolis. A lot of these coal yards were also lumber yards. And coal and lumber came from the large quantities of lumber came from the same general area of Western Pennsylvania, Western Maryland. But the reason for putting them together is they're both bulk commodities. And so they transported by train very well, and they could be set up in a yard like this one here, and becomes a convenient distribution point. So as you go around Southern Maryland, generally where you see a coal yard, it's also a lumber yard. If you see a place that's selling lumber, chances are they're also selling coal. This was true in my youth too. We burned a bit of coal, or experimented with it when I was a kid in the fireplace, and we picked up a bag of coal actually at a lumber yard. We see lots of advertisements in newspapers. The one on the left, coal and wood. John Keeley, and listen to this, is selling a nice article of chestnut coal. And I think by what they mean by chestnut coal is the size of a chestnut. Very low. All other kind of coal and wood in stock, selling it out at reduced prices. This sounds like a fellow who's basically shutting down his business. And on the other side, these are both 1887. We have Joseph Basil selling coal and wood, exclamation point. And he's got a coal wharf, steam saw and grist mill. So not water powered, but steam powered, steam engine, presumably fed by coal. Again, because he's milling lumber and selling coal, hard, soft, and medium coal, anthracite, and bituminous. I'm not sure. Yeah, again, coal, because it forms sort of this continuum. You don't just have anthracite and bituminous, and there's nothing in between. One grades into the other. And so what constituted hard coal, soft coal, and medium coal, I'm not sure. Certainly, if you had the money, you sprung for the more expensive anthracite because it was more efficient. It was probably more cost effective because you got more heat out of a ton of coal. And this guy's also selling not only lumber, but also kindling wood. So he's got it covered. Yeah, for those of you who don't know, when you start a coal fire in a stove, you do need wood to get it going. I don't know if anybody started a coal fire directly from coal. I certainly never did. The 1 year that I lived in a house heated by coal. This graph shows you the coal dealers from 1885 to 1921, just the number of them. So in 1885, there are 4 of them. That suggests that, it's been around a little while. It's for a small town like Annapolis, that's a fair number of vendors. And it goes up to 8 and even 9 before dropping down to around, an average of 4. And 4 coal yards probably would have been adequate for the city of Annapolis, keeping in mind some of the communities around, like Odenton, also had their own coal yards. So at this point, after 1908, well, I mean, the fact that there are 4 coal yards operating in 1885 suggests that, at least in the city, coal is becoming the fuel of choice. And it is a city, you don't have timber lots around where you can harvest your own wood, so it kind of makes sense. What's going on in the rural areas, we don't know. A picture from Baltimore of how coal was delivered. This is 1913, so it's quite an early truck. You'll notice some chains and lifts and everything. This is essentially a dump truck, and it's full of coal, so they could bring it to one load at a time, probably bringing it to their customer and unloading it. The more typical way would have been horse and wagon. And here they're backing up. They throw down a couple planks to make it across the street train. They backed it up to the house. And what you cannot see, you can see from the houses around, it's clearly an urban area. Uh, but what you can't see is there's essentially a basement window there. And that basement window isn't a window, it's a chute. And there would be, in the basement, there'd be a chute leading down to a coal bin, usually made of concrete, maybe concrete block if it was added, or maybe if it was installed when they built the house, it might all be poured concrete. But it'd just be sort of an open bin and the stuff would be dumped down there. And then you would shovel that coal into a basement furnace. Maybe this house had a coal-fired kitchen stove, in which case you'd load up a scuttle and have to carry it up the stairs to the kitchen, unless the kitchen was in the basement. But this is the means of delivery. You would simply place an order for probably a ton of coal, cost several dollars, and how often you needed it, depending on how cold the winter would be, but certainly just cooking with it wouldn't require very much. So Liz found this interesting graphic in a serial publication, a magazine or something. And it was meant to kind of extol the beauty of coal, of heating with coal. So here you have the man of the house sitting next to his coal stove. It's hard to see, but the stove is actually, there's a pipe. It's vented through an enclosed fireplace. So they've filled in the fireplace, leaving just a hole for the circular duct, the chimney pipe, to take the exhaust out into the existing chimney. Now, this is a cutaway view. You know, cut through the floor, and there's a vent just above the stove. And the lady of the house is sitting there right next to it, probably nice and warm and cozy, because, of course, heat rises. If she'd moved over a little more so her skirt would cover over the vent, she'd be right warm, quite toasty. Here's just the center is just an image of, basically, there's a lot of variability. Stoves been around since the 18th century. You've all heard of the Franklin stove, something Benjamin Franklin invented and refused to take out any patent on it. He wanted it available for everybody. And those stoves became very common, mostly for heating. They were called parlor stoves, and they were meant to burn wood. So they were made of cast iron, but in such ways they could withstand the heat of an intense wood fire. But most of them couldn't withstand the heat of a much hotter coal fire. The wood fire usually get oranges and reds and maybe a flicker or two of blue flame. With fresh coal, good hard coal, it's blue flame. It's very hot, which is part of the expense in adopting coal as a heating material. So there were companies that sold these things, and they'd advertise. Here's just a close-up again of that cutaway with the vent in the floor. You'll notice the fireplace is all filled in, and there's a little urn there, probably with dried flowers in it. And she's sitting right next to the fireplace in her billowy skirt. You could not do this with open hearth. The chances of a woman's clothing catching a fire are very great. And so coal, among other things, was safer, especially for women in the household. I've got a report from, I think, 1920 or so from northern Anne Arundel County, where a guy was just going down the road, and this woman came running out of her house, her dress all afire. So he went and helped her put out the fire and then took her into Baltimore to a hospital, but she died a month later. And that probably was not an unusual happenstance. Open fire is very dangerous. Coal fires, whether a furnace in the basement or an enclosed kitchen stove, a range, or a parlor stove, much safer. So, what are the pros and cons of adopting coal? Well, the stoves are safer, or safer than open hearths. They required less tending. If you've had a fireplace, you're always poking away at the damn wood and throwing on another log and all that. With coal, you could really, once that fire is going, you could fill it up with coal and leave it unattended for hours. And typically at night, what you do is you kind of bank up the coal and cover it with some ash to keep it burning at a low rate, but keep it going all night long. So when you get up the following morning, it's still freezing. You throw a couple pieces of wood on there, a couple pieces of coal, and it starts up pretty quickly. I know in the house I lived in Eastern Long Island, two-story house with just a big coal-fired kitchen range in the kitchen and coal-grate fireplaces elsewhere through the house. In the middle of the winter, getting out of bed, it was really cold because the stove had really, gone low on heat. But it was pretty quick and easy to get it fired up again. Before you know it, the heat in the kitchen would be stultifying. The coal provides a higher heat and a steadier heat. And it's convenient, again, because you're not constantly fiddling with it and throwing in wood. You do have to shake the grate from time to time to get the ashes to drop down into a box below. That way oxygen can get in there. And there's also an element of prestige involved, at least early on, in having a coal stove rather than using wood. And as I'll talk about a little bit in a few moments, to me, adopting coal, particularly in the 19th century, suggests embracing modernity. And not just fashion, but going after the modern, looking at the future rather than embracing traditional types of behaviors. The cons of having a coal stove: you can't go out and dig your own coal. Not if you live around here in Southern Maryland. Unlike if you're burning wood, you can keep a wood lot and cut wood during the winter, let it season. Following winter, it's ready to go. You can provide your own fuel at essentially no cost but the labor. Coal stoves also high startup costs. You have to buy a special stove, and a Franklin type stove, a wood stove, probably isn't going to work. Coal stoves typically have an oven portion that's got refractory brick or some sort of refractory material that conserves the heat. And if your house is already built, you're going to have to modify it. You have to fill in that fireplace, perhaps do other things to accommodate the house to this new heating system. You have to purchase it. You can't make your own. And it produces a lot of ash. The ash I had in my house on Long Island, the coal I had a ton of coal, but it had been sitting there for several years. It wasn't fresh. And coal loses some of that energy density as it sits around and weathers. But still, it was producing nearly a cubic foot of ash every day. That's a lot of ash. And I used it to fill in the potholes in my dirt driveway. It was quite long, but eventually I ran out of potholes. And you can't use it for fertilizer. It's terrible. It actually hinders growth. So those are the pros and cons of using that system. So I use an example at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. Two examples, actually, three examples. Most of you have been to these talks before. I've heard about the Selman House. This is our historic house on campus. It's the oldest Smithsonian-owned building that's still in its original location. But this gives you a view of the house and surroundings. This is that same house, a map, that shows all the little fly specks represent shovel test pits that we dug in 2012. And we screen the soil and we save all the artifacts and bring them back to the lab and wash and catalog. And so for each shovel test pit, we were able to, figure out how much coal ash was present. We then took those numbers and generated a map simulating the distribution of coal ash based on our sampling. And you can see the picture I showed you was coming in from behind the house on the right-hand side. That's the back of the house, but you could see this plume of coal ash stretching several hundred feet, going down slope towards the road. Also, some bits of ash off to the side here. What's interesting for us, this house was built in 1735 and greatly enlarged in 1841. And it may have been in 1841 when they opened up this new part of the house that they by then started burning coal because there are fireplaces in each room, but they're coal grates. Interestingly, this red line here represents the summer kitchen that we excavated. It didn't have any coal ash around it. And it was around probably from the late 18th century, and probably went out of use, was probably demolished sometime in the 1840s when the renovations to the main house had been completed. So there's, no coal ash pre-1840, let's say, lots of coal ash after 1840. So the Selmans, who, they're an elite family, reasonably wealthy, not uber wealthy, but they held their own. They probably adopted coal fairly early relative to their neighbors. Now, there are other elite houses in the area where we have not done archaeology. It would be interesting to see when and if those houses, people of comparable wealth and prestige, when did they adopt coal as a fuel? So here's the house again, Selman House, the summer kitchen, a little oversized. Off to the far right, really going off the map, is the Brown tenancy. This is a tenant farmer house on the Selman property, later the Kirkpatrick Howard property, that the University of Maryland excavated back in 2014, 15, something like that. And here's the footprint of that house. SEAL team has done a little bit of more work on it after the University of Maryland, so it's why our drawing isn't quite like theirs. We've added a few features like windows, for instance, in blue. And if you notice this little open square down here next to that dashed line, that's a stove chimney. That's a brick chimney built specifically to accommodate the stove. There's no open hearth in this building. The building dates sometime to the early 20th century and was probably vacated by, let's say, 1950. And here's Dana Link doing some excavations around the base of the toppled chimney. So we could tell exactly where that chimney was located. See these simulations again, these distributions, they're not a coal ash. This is architectural artifacts, nails, window glass, brick, etc. I don't have a map showing the distribution of coal ash around the Brown tenancy, for the simple reason that there's no coal ash. None of the excavations, none of the shovel test pits produced any coal ash. Clearly, these people were burning wood in a wood stove in the early 20th century. Why weren't they burning coal? One obvious answer is, well, they're not the Selmans, they're tenants. They don't have a lot of money. Maybe they just couldn't afford the investment that it would take to use coal as a fuel, and then, of course, to have to buy coal periodically rather than just going into the woods and cutting firewood. That could be the answer. However, we do have another tenant house at the south end of the Cirque campus. This is something over a mile, maybe almost, well, it's a probably close to 2 miles away from the Selman House. It's still standing, although largely out of matter of habit rather than anything structural. You can look inside the building, and here you see on the right, this is a chimney like the one at the Brown Tenancy, built specifically to accommodate the stove. And you can see the circular aperture up here for the stovepipe. So they had a stove. Are they burning wood in it, or are they burning coal in it? I don't have a distribution map. Have to dig up the data for it. But I know we got coal ash. We didn't do a lot of work around this building, just some shovel testing, but we found coal ash. This house dates again to the early 20th century, it's pretty much contemporary with the Brown Tenancy. Why were these people burning coal? It's an African American family. Of, well, modest means would be overstating it. Just like the Browns. Why are they burning coal and the Browns are not? So here, money maybe doesn't enter into it. And here's where I think perhaps a different ethos has clicked in, where the Browns may be more traditional in their outlook on life, and the Downs may have been more interested in modernity. We'll have to keep looking for data and testing that. So let's just switch to coal use, broadening our area in Southern Maryland, at least. Here we're just going to look at the first district, first election district of Anne Arundel County. And Smithsonian Environmental Research Center is located in the first district. This and the following drawing are going to make a reappearance in a couple of weeks at a professional meeting, and a paper that Ray and I are giving, not on coal. Historic map, 1878 map of the first election district, just to give you a sense of it's essentially a rural population with little kind of hamlets at crossroads. So not urban at all. Annapolis is on the other side of the South River and outside the frame of the map. Another view of the first district showing roads and drainages and whatnot. These red dots represent archaeological sites. And it's not by any means complete. We have more than that Liz looked at several years ago. And what we were trying to do is look at these sites that archaeologists had found, and based on their reporting of whether or not there's coal ash, kind of get some sense of the distribution. And what we ended up with, what Liz came up with, is this from 388 sites. These are sites in first election district, 1720, through after 1930. And this graph suggests that people are burning coal beginning in the 18th century. And it peaks around 1900 and then starts falling off. The problem with the data we have at this point is when archaeologists report sites to the Maryland Historical Trust, we register those sites. We give them a registration number so we can keep track of them. But there's one part of the form looks like this, where cultural affiliation, historic. If you have a multi-component site, if you have a site that has archaeological remains from the late 17th century, well into the 20th century, you're going to mark Y for yes for each of those date ranges. Now, maybe you found coal ash there, but that doesn't mean the coal ash dates to 1676 or to 1781. It's just that the site has been occupied for so long, and that's what we're trying to track. How long has that site been occupied? If it's got coal ash, that coal ash is probably associated with sometime after 1861. But when we're just doing an archaeological survey and we're finding this stuff, we can't tell what it dates to. So this graph here is terribly misleading. and it has to do with how we report what we find in the field. So what we're looking at, and Liz and I haven't, we don't have this. I mean, we could do additional research in each of these areas, but we've got the coal mine part. There's lots of literature on that. There's archaeology on coal mining sites and mining villages and all that. We got lots of information on transportation networks and how those networks changed over the course of the last uh, 200 years. We could use more information, but we're getting pretty good information on coal distributors. It's misspelled. And we could do more because there are these coal and lumber yards, these sites around the area. And I've partially looked at one over in Odenton, but by and large, they had not attracted archaeological attention. So we don't know a lot about these coal yards, exactly where they are, when they were in operation, what kinds of material did they sell, different grades of coal. How large were they? Did they expand their operations? I mean, there's a lot we can do with them, but the research simply hasn't been done yet. We have a good kind of basic feel for it at this point. It's the consumer part. Uh, there's a lot of folks who don't even report coal ash when they find it at early stages of archaeological investigation. So our data here are very poor. But they're important because we want to ask that question. When do different households, when do different communities adopt coal as a fuel? Because again, going back to the pros and cons, there are advantages, there are major disadvantages. And right now we're looking at it, I think the tendency is to look at it in terms of wealth. If you can afford it, you will buy a coal stove and you will buy coal. However, as showed with that initial comparison between the brown tendency and the down tendency, it may be that there's more to it than money. Everybody has limited amount of money, most of us do anyway. And we decide how we're going to use that money. Some people in the early 20th century and going back into the late 19th century decided to install coal burning facilities and to buy coal on a regular basis. Others stuck with firewood. Does that suggest something about their outlook on life? And is our outlook simply limited to tenant farmers? Do we see that amongst the very wealthy? Do we see some of these manor type houses where there's no coal ash? It seems all they're burning is wood. That would be interesting to learn. But the quality of data recording has to improve. And also coal ash is very difficult to date. If we find it on a site like the Selman House, was it used from 1841? Did they not adopt it till 1881 or 1901 or 1921? We have the data where we can actually explore that and see, nail that date down, I think. But it's hard. Coal doesn't have a particular style like a piece of ceramic, so it's very difficult to date. Anyway, so these are our observations. Coal ash can help date sites, although only in very broad terms. It's consistently, I think, underreported by professional archaeologists. When we do find coal ash, it tells us they're burning coal there. It's not brought in for any other reason. One minor exception is if it's a site that somebody is a contractor in the 20th century, could be making his own concrete blocks that people, you could buy machines for making concrete blocks, and they could buy cinders, coal cinders, and bring them to the site, mix that with the Portland, and so that becomes the aggregate and what we call cinder blocks. When I was a kid, we call those concrete blocks cinder blocks. And that's because most of them were made with coal ash. They're made with cinders. So that's a strange exception. If we're finding coal ash, these people burning coal. The problem is attributing that coal ash, that deposit, to a particular component of the site. Obviously, sites that are occupied for very short periods of time, it's a lot easier to date when they start burning coal. So we need to promote reporting of this, maybe get the Maryland Historical Trust to put coal ash as something to check off on the site form. There are ledgers, household ledgers, distributor ledgers that we might be able to find and look at to get some sense of how people are buying this stuff. And we can actually excavate coal yards when the opportunity arises, although it doesn't happen often. And then again, determining what we want to do is determine motives for choosing fuel types. Why does somebody decide? Why does a household decide to start using coal and no longer use wood? So anyway, that's all I got for this evening. I'm happy to take questions.
A question about our CRM archaeology. I spent 30 years in the US Army Corps of Engineers, and 95% of the time, the Corps did not want me to report my insights. And I often sent the trust my insights without the Corps knowing. That was one way I got around reporting what I observed at the archaeological sites.
Well,
this is an issue that needs addressing, perhaps.
well, I think first of all, we're going to have to discontinue your pension.
There you go.
Notify the Army Corps.
There you go.
This is being recorded. Yeah,
all
well,
right.
I think a lot of you said CRM archaeology. I
Yeah.
like commercial archaeology. For those of you who aren't aware, I mean, this is a business nowadays to do archaeological surveys for clients who are usually applying for some sort of permit. I think a lot of folks out in the field, because they don't understand the value, because they didn't attend to this evening's talk. Coal ash is just, it's like just there are other things more important, things you can date, like ceramics and bottle glass and tobacco pipes, and that's the sort of stuff that folks really focus on. And it's unfortunate because we're losing a lot of valuable data. I've run into this before for those of you who sat through the pig manure talk, manuring fields with urban trash. Archaeologists have been looking at that stuff for years and either not recognizing it or just calling it field scatter. And yet it tells us a lot about farming strategies, particularly in the first half of the 20th century. And it's simply not recording it. And even when they do recognize it, they're not picking the stuff up. They're not looking at its, spatial distribution. So coal is a similar problem. People don't recognize the research value, and so they give it little heed. But I think if it shows up on a site form that you have to fill out when you find a site and you're registering it, coal ash, present or absence. Again, it might be a multi-component site. You may not know when that coal was burned, but at least you know there's coal ash on that site and somebody was burning it. That's a start.
Yes, yes. Our archaeology forums would benefit for new insights, new archaeology. When the archaeologist is out in the field, not just to fill in the existing knowledge, but new knowledge.
Yeah, that's scholarship, Steve.
Yep.
If folks who do this work do not stay up on the literature, if they don't go to conferences and listen to talks, if they don't stop in at lectures like this, they're not constantly retooling. They're not aware of where the research is going these days, and so they're behind the eight ball. And of course, the research in general suffers because we don't have their inputs. So training is really important, constant training. A lot of folks get their master's degree and even their doctoral degrees, and they go, okay, done. Education's all done with. And they don't go back to school. They're not reading, they're not going to conferences and stuff like that. And it does affect the research. It affects what all of us can do. Anybody else? earlier, we have a couple more talks that are scheduled, one on covered bridges, one on something else, I forget. But more importantly, I have committed to doing a series of these things now on the American Revolution. So they're going to be more history based rather than archaeological, although I'll try to get some archaeology in there too. And we might do those through the summer because we're running out of time. The 250th anniversary is barely more than 2 years away, and our country's barely gotten started, as opposed to the bicentennial, where folks were well at it 5 years beforehand. So that's my plan. If you have any suggestions or things you'd like me to talk about, I will do so. It's not going to be about battles, though, not that much about battles. Okay. Well, thank you for joining us this evening.